Moving into my first solo apartment was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning, a place to call my own. The moment I stepped into the small, outdated unit, something about it felt off. But I ignored it. After all, it was cheap, in a decent neighborhood, and most importantly, I was finally living alone. The apartment had charm, in a rundown kind of way. The wooden floorboards creaked under my feet, and the walls carried the scent of old varnish. It had been unoccupied for years before I signed the lease, the landlord told me. That should have been my first warning. At first, everything seemed normal. The first few nights, I unpacked, set up furniture, and tried to settle in. But small things started to bother me. Items weren't where I remembered placing them. The TV remote kept ending up on the kitchen counter when I swore I'd left it on the couch. A light bulb in the bathroom flickered despite being brand new. And then there was the fridge. One morning I walked into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, only to find the fridge door slightly ajar. Half of the milk was gone. A sandwich I'd made the night before was missing. I stood there, confused. Had I sleepwalked? Forgotten that I had eaten in the middle of the night? Shrugging it off, I dismissed it as stress. Moving was exhausting, after all. But the next night, I double-checked everything. I closed the fridge door tightly. I even took a picture on my phone to prove to myself that it had been shut. The next morning, the fridge was open again. And this time, a dirty plate was in the sink, one I hadn't used. My stomach twisted. The realization was like ice water down my spine. Either I was losing my mind, or someone had been inside my apartment. That was the first time I started locking my bedroom door at night. The paranoia started to creep in like an infection. I tried to rationalize everything that had happened so far. The misplaced items, the open fridge, the dirty plate. Maybe I had been exhausted from moving and simply forgot things. Maybe the fridge door hadn't been latched properly. Maybe I had eaten in the middle of the night and just forgotten. But the explanation felt hollow. My gut screamed at me that something was wrong. That night I took precautions. I locked my bedroom door. I wedged a chair against it. I checked every closet, every cabinet, every possible hiding place. I even inspected under the bed like a child afraid of monsters. Finally satisfied, I crawled into bed and turned off the lamp. But sleep didn't come easy. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old apartment settling in the night, the wooden beams adjusting to the temperature shift, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of cars passing on the street below. Then, something else. A shuffling sound, soft, deliberate, coming from the kitchen. I held my breath, every muscle tensed. Was it my imagination? I slowly reached for my phone on the nightstand and checked the time, 3:12 a.m. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the door. The chair was still in place. The lock was intact. Then why did I feel like someone was standing just beyond the door? A few agonizing minutes passed and the shuffling stopped. I forced myself to breathe. I was being ridiculous. My nerves were shot, and I was imagining things. It was an old building. Of course it would make noises at night. I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. But the next morning brought a fresh horror. Something was in my room. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was that my bedroom door was slightly open. The chair I had wedged against it was moved. Panic surged through my veins as I bolted upright. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, scrolling through my camera app. I had left it recording overnight just in case. Heart hammering, I played the video. At first, it was nothing but darkness. The sound of my slow, steady breathing filled the room. The occasional shift of sheets as I tossed in my sleep. Then, at 3:12 a.m., the screen flickered. Something moved. The door handle twisted. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the door crept open by itself. Number, not by itself. There was a shadow just beyond the doorway. A figure, tall and motionless, barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. The shadow watched me. For 5 minutes it stood there. Then, as silently as it had come, it disappeared back into the hallway. The door remained ajar. I barely made it to the bathroom before I vomited. The fear sets in. I didn't go to work that day. I couldn't. I paced around my apartment, every shadow a threat, every noise a warning. I checked the locks 100 times, but they weren't enough. Someone had been in my home. And worse, they had been in my room, watching me. I called the landlord immediately. "There's no way anyone else has keys," he assured me. "I had the locks changed before you moved in." "Then how do you explain this?" I snapped, sending him the video. There was a long silence. Then, in a nervous tone, he said, "I'll come by later today. We'll check the apartment together." I didn't like the hesitation in his voice. An unsettling discovery. When the landlord arrived that afternoon, he brought an extra set of locks. "Just in case," he said, though he still seemed unconvinced that anyone had been in the apartment. I insisted we check every inch of the place before we did anything. The closets, the bathroom, under the bed, all empty. And then we checked the kitchen pantry. The door was small, barely wider than my shoulders. I had stored some cleaning supplies in there, never really thinking about it. But as the landlord swung the door open, his face lost all color. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. And then I saw it, a small hole in the back of the pantry, no bigger than a dinner plate leading into the wall. The edges were worn smooth, as if someone had been crawling through it for years. The air left my lungs. "Oh my God," I whispered. The landlord didn't say a word. He just looked at me, his face pale and stricken. We weren't alone in the apartment, and we hadn't been for a long time. The hole in the pantry wall was no accident. It had been used. The edges of the opening were smooth, worn down by repeated passage. The inside was too dark to see anything clearly, but the air that wafted out smelled stale and damp, like something had been rotting inside. I couldn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears as my mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. This wasn't just a small crevice in the wall. This was an entrance. To where? The landlord exhaled sharply and stepped back. I didn't know about this," he said, his voice uneven. I swallowed hard. "Where does it lead?" He hesitated. "I have no idea." The worst part? I believed him. His shock looked genuine, but that didn't make me feel any better. It just meant that someone else had been using this hole. Someone who wasn't supposed to be here. I forced myself to take a step forward. My knees were weak, but I needed to see. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and leaned in, shining the light into the hole. The beam revealed something horrible. A crawl space, just wide enough for a person to move through. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. The floor was coated in filth, dust, and something darker. Stains that made my stomach churn. And then I saw them. Fingernail marks. Someone had lived in there. A nest in the walls. The landlord finally snapped out of his shock. We need to call the police," he stammered. I nodded, barely breathing. "Yeah." He pulled out his phone, but as he started dialing, something moved inside the crawl space. A scraping noise. My heart stopped. Something was still in there. I jerked back, barely suppressing a scream. My phone's flashlight flickered against the filth-covered walls, and for just a second I thought I saw a hand retreating into the darkness. A hand. "Get away from it!" the landlord hissed, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. We stumbled into the kitchen just as he hit dial. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. Every minute that passed, I expected something to crawl out of the hole. The police investigation. When the cops arrived, I felt an overwhelming rush of relief. But that relief was short-lived. 2 officers examined the pantry while a third questioned me. I told them everything. The misplaced objects, the open fridge, the video of the shadowy figure standing in my doorway. The cop, listening to me, nodded grimly, but didn't seem surprised. Then one of the officers crawled into the hole. I held my breath as his flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness. We listened as he shuffled forward, moving deeper into the walls of my apartment. Then his voice echoed back. "Oh, Jesus Christ." I clenched my fists. "What is it?" "You're gonna want to see this," he called back. I didn't want to see. I really didn't. but I forced myself to step forward. The officer emerged from the crawl space, his face pale. "There's a whole tunnel system back there. Leads to an old storage room behind the building." I blinked. "Storage room?" He nodded grimly. "Except, it's not just storage." He turned his flashlight toward the opening, illuminating the space behind him. Inside the crawl space, just out of reach, was a makeshift bed, an old, rotting mattress pushed against the wall. Next to it was a pile of crumpled fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and something worse, a pile of clothes. Clothes that weren't mine, clothes that belonged to other people. He wasn't alone. The other officer reappeared from deeper inside the tunnels, carrying something in his hand. A notebook. I took an involuntary step back. What is that?" He flipped through the pages. His face darkened. "Logs." My stomach twisted. "Logs?" He nodded, handing me the book. "Someone was keeping notes about you." I hesitated before taking it. The cover was old, the pages stained. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. The first entry was dated months before I moved in. The handwriting was erratic, scrawled in red ink. The girl before her was quieter. This one moves too much. My breath hitched. My hands trembled as I turned the page. "She keeps locking her door. I don't like that." I flipped faster. "She put up cameras. I'll have to be more careful." The most recent entry was the worst. It was written the night before. "She's starting to notice." I dropped the notebook like it had burned me. Whoever had been watching me had still been here last night. The police didn't leave right away. They insisted on searching the entire tunnel system, convinced that whoever had been living in my walls was still nearby. I sat on the couch, hugging my knees, my eyes darting to the pantry every few seconds. Every creak in the old apartment made me flinch. I kept expecting someone to emerge from the hole, to see that shadowy figure from my door, standing in my kitchen, watching me with hollow eyes. One of the officers returned, shaking his head. "He's gone," he said grimly, "but not for long." "What do you mean?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The officer glanced at the notebook in his hands, the same one filled with disturbing entries about me. "This guy's been living here for years," he said, "long before you moved in. He knew the walls like the back of his hand. He probably had multiple exits." My stomach churned. "You think he's coming back?" The officer hesitated. "I think he might have nowhere else to go. Locks aren't enough. The landlord replaced the locks that same night, double-checking every entry point into my apartment. But it wasn't enough. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The man I hadn't even seen yet but could feel. I imagined him crouching in the shadows, pressing his ear against the thin walls, listening to my breathing, waiting for me to let my guard down. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I was getting the hell out of there. The police had offered to let me stay somewhere safe, but I refused. I needed to be far away from this apartment. I packed my bags in a frenzy, shoving clothes into suitcases, barely thinking. The sooner I was out, the better. But as I was throwing the last of my things into my bag, I noticed something odd. One of my sweaters was missing. A sweater I hadn't worn in weeks. My hands went cold. The realization hit me like a brick to the chest. He had been in my apartment since the police left. I wasn't alone. The escape I didn't think. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted for the door. I had barely yanked it open when I heard it, the sound of something shifting inside the walls. It was faint, but unmistakable. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things. He was still here. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car, gasping for breath, my hands shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. As I pulled away, I saw something in the rearview mirror that made my blood run cold. The pantry door was wide open, and the hole in the wall? Empty. He had been watching me pack. He had been waiting for me to leave. The aftermath, I never went back to that apartment. I don't know what happened to it after I left. The landlord told me later that he sealed up the tunnels, that the police never found the man. But I knew the truth. He was still out there, maybe in another apartment, maybe in another set of walls, watching, waiting for someone else to move in. Leaving the apartment should have made me feel safe. It didn't. Even after I checked into a hotel across town, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. Every sound made my skin crawl. Every shadow in the corner of the dimly lit room made my stomach twist. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined waking up to find my hotel door cracked open, just like my bedroom door that night. By morning, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to their breaking point. That's when I got the call from the landlord. The landlord's confession. His voice was shaky. I think I know who he is. I gripped my phone tighter. Who? The landlord exhaled. Years ago, before you moved in, I had another tenant in that unit. Young woman about your age. Lived there alone. My stomach churned. What happened to her? He hesitated. She vanished. Just disappeared. Left everything behind. Cops thought she skipped town, but now I don't know. A sickening thought hit me. What if she never left? I whispered. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then the landlord dropped another bombshell. You weren't the first person to report strange things happening in that apartment. The others. He told me about them, the tenant before me, and the one before her. Both complained of missing items, strange noises at night, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. Neither stayed longer than a few months. And before that, the apartment sat empty for years after the original woman vanished. No one wanted to live there. Until me. The nausea was overwhelming. Why didn't you tell me this before I moved in? I didn't think. The landlord's voice cracked. I thought they were just paranoid. But now, Jesus. Now I'm scared too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that sent an icy bolt of terror through me. You should be careful. I swallowed hard. What do you mean? He hesitated again. The police never found him. I already knew that, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel more real. The man in my walls was still out there, and he knew who I was. The first sign. He had followed me. I tried to convince myself I was safe. I wasn't. That night, back in the hotel, I forced myself to eat something. I took a long, hot shower, and then, finally, I crawled under the covers and tried to sleep. I didn't think I'd be able to, but exhaustion won over fear. Until, thump. I shot up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was knocking. Not at my door. At the wall. I froze. My hands clenched the sheets so tightly my knuckles turned white. The knocking was slow, deliberate, like a signal, or a message. I didn't move, I barely breathed. And then, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. My hands trembled as I opened it. You moved, but I can still see you. I stared at my phone screen, my breath frozen in my chest. You moved, but I can still see you. The glowing letters blurred as my mind raced. How? No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone except the police and my landlord. I had used a different credit card to check in. I even asked the hotel receptionist not to give my room number to anyone. And yet, someone had found me. Or worse, someone had been watching me this entire time. The knocking on the wall had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I peeled the blankets off and slipped out of bed, keeping my phone clutched in my shaking hands. I turned off the screen and listened. The hotel room was dead silent. No footsteps, no whispers, no movement. I crept toward the window and peeked through the curtain. The parking lot below was dimly lit. mostly empty except for a few scattered cars. No one stood outside. But then, just as I was about to step away, a shadow moved. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. For a brief second, I thought I saw something, a figure near the edge of the lot, lurking just outside the glow of the streetlights, watching, waiting. Then it was gone. I swallowed hard, backing away from the window. I needed to get out of here. The hotel security footage. I grabbed my bag and yanked on my shoes. Every second I stayed in that room felt like a death sentence. But before I left, I did one last thing. I called the front desk. "This is room 214, I whispered. "Can you check the security cameras? I think someone's following me." There was a pause. Then the receptionist, a young guy with a bored voice, sighed. "Sure, give me a minute." I waited, my pulse hammering. A minute stretched into 2, then 3. Finally, the line clicked back on. The receptionist's voice wasn't bored anymore. It was shaken. Yeah, there's something weird." I gripped the phone tighter. "What do you see?" "I checked the hallway camera outside your room," he said. "And, someone was standing in front of your door for over an hour." My stomach dropped. "What?" I breathed. "Yeah, they just stood there, never knocked, never moved, just stood there, staring at your door." The room started to spin. "When did they leave?" I managed to ask. Another pause. Then, "They didn't." He was still here. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I grabbed my things and bolted. The hallway outside my room was empty, but I didn't trust it. I ran to the elevator, slamming the button over and over. When the doors finally slid open, I jumped inside and hit the lobby button. The ride down felt agonizingly slow. The air in the elevator felt thick, suffocating. My mind replayed the receptionist's words over and over. They didn't leave. When the doors finally opened, I burst into the lobby. The receptionist, a skinny guy with tired eyes, looked up from the desk. His face paled when he saw me. Hey," he started. "Listen, I just called security. You should probably stay here until—" "Where is he?" I interrupted. My voice was shaking. He hesitated. Then he pointed toward the stairwell. "He went in there about 5 minutes ago," he said. "Hasn't come out." The stairwell door was slightly ajar, a dark, gaping mouth leading into the unknown. The air left my lungs. He had been waiting for me. I had to run. I turned back to the receptionist. "Can you call the police?" He nodded quickly and grabbed the phone. I didn't wait. I ran to the parking lot, my heart hammering. My car keys were already in my hand, my fingers slick with sweat as I unlocked the door and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and then, bang! Something slammed against my passenger side window. I screamed. My head snapped toward the sound and I saw him. A pale face pressed against the glass, wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. His hand smacked the window again. Bang! I floored the gas pedal. The tires screeched as I sped out of the parking lot, nearly hitting another car. My vision blurred with panic, my hands trembling against the wheel. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving. Because I knew, if I stopped, he would find me again. I didn't stop driving. The road stretched ahead, illuminated only by the cold glow of my headlights. My hands were shaking, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The image of his pale face pressed against my car window was burned into my mind. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape him. The police would check the hotel. I knew that. But what could they really do? They hadn't found him the first time. They wouldn't find him now. He had lived in my walls for years. He knew how to disappear. And now he was following me. The rest stop. An hour passed, maybe 2. I wasn't even sure where I was anymore. Just an endless stretch of road, the occasional headlights of another car flashing by like ghosts in the night. Then I saw the sign. Rest stop, 1 mile. I needed to stop. I needed a moment to breathe. I pulled into the lot, my heart still pounding. The rest stop was empty, just a row of vending machines, a dimly lit bathroom, and a few benches. Beyond that, the road stretched into dark nothingness. I parked near the lights. My fingers fumbled as I reached for my phone. I needed to call someone, anyone, but my hands were too slick with sweat. I could barely hold the damn thing. Then in the rearview mirror I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the lot, not moving, just watching. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. I couldn't stay here. A surge of panic shot through me. My body screamed at me to run, to drive away, to do something, but my limbs felt frozen. He just stood there, barely visible in the dim light. I could almost make out his face, pale, expressionless. But his eyes weren't normal. They were wide, unblinking, staring straight at me like I was something he owned, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. I snapped out of it. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement as I spun around and sped the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I couldn't, because if I did, I knew I'd see him running after me. And if I saw him chasing me down that dark, empty road, I don't think I would have survived the night. Where could I go? I kept driving. City lights eventually appeared in the distance, a dull orange glow breaking through the suffocating blackness of the highway. I headed straight for them. Motel, gas station, anywhere with people. I found a 24-hour diner, the kind that smelled like stale coffee and burnt toast. I parked under the neon lights and stumbled inside, my entire body shaking. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave me a concerned look as I collapsed into a booth. "You okay, honey?" she asked. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to scream, "There's a man following me. He lived in my walls. He won't stop watching me." But I couldn't, because the moment I opened my mouth, something outside caught my eye. A car parked across the street, engine running, headlights off. I couldn't see inside, but I knew. I felt it. He was inside, watching, waiting, and suddenly, I realized the truth. I could run, I could drive to another city, another state, but it wouldn't matter. He would always find me. The diner felt safe. The warm glow of the fluorescent lights, the low hum of conversation from the few late-night customers, the smell of greasy food lingering in the air. It was a lifeline. But outside, the car across the street never moved. I kept my eyes on it, my stomach twisting into knots. Was it him? I wanted to believe I was being paranoid, that it was just some stranger, parked there for their own reasons. But deep down, I knew. I felt him. Waiting. Watching. Hunting. A plan forms. The waitress came back with a steaming cup of coffee. "You sure you're okay, honey?" I hesitated. Then, an idea hit me. "Yeah," I lied. My ex-boyfriend won't leave me alone. He's been following me." Her expression hardened. "You want me to call someone?" But I swallowed. "Could you do me a favor?" She nodded. I leaned in, lowering my voice. "If I leave, and that car outside follows me, could you call the police?" She glanced at the window, frowning. "That one? The black sedan?" My stomach dropped. She had noticed it too. "I was watching it earlier," she murmured. "It pulled in right after you did. No one got out." A cold shiver ran down my spine. It was him. I forced myself to stay calm. "So you'll call if it follows me?" Her frown deepened, but she nodded. "Yeah, of course, sweetie." I exhaled, forcing a smile. "Thanks." Now I just had to get out of here without him realizing I knew. The bait and switch, I reached into my bag and pulled out 2 receipts. One from my last gas station stop, the other from earlier that day. Then, I grabbed a pen. I scribbled down a fake motel address on one and left it on the table, making it look like I had just been searching for a place to stay. Then, I stuffed the real receipt into my pocket. If he broke into my car, or if he was watching from the diner window, he'd think I was heading to the fake address. I paid for my coffee and forced myself to walk slowly out of the diner. My hands trembled as I unlocked my car, my ears straining for any movement. I slid inside, locked the doors, and gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Then I drove, but not toward the fake motel. Instead, I took a detour, 3 left turns around the block just to see if the car would follow. It did. My chest tightened. He was following me, but I was leading him into a trap. The trap is set. I took another turn, heading toward a police station. I had looked up the address while sitting in the diner just in case. The black sedan stayed behind me the entire time. Closer now. I could almost feel his eyes boring into the back of my skull. I took a deep breath. One more turn. The police station came into view. At the last second, I slammed the brakes, yanked the wheel, and swerved into the station's parking lot. The black sedan kept driving, fast, like he had realized too late what was happening. I watched as it disappeared down the street, my heart hammering in my chest. I had shaken him. For now. The officer's warning. Inside the station, I filed a report. The officers took me seriously, more seriously than I expected. When I told them about the hotel security footage, the crawl space, the notebook filled with logs of my movements, their expressions darkened. One officer, a man in his 40s with a tired face, leaned forward. "You need to leave town." My throat tightened. "I already did." He shook his head. "Number for real. Don't just move to another motel, don't stay on the grid. This guy isn't just some creep. He's been hunting you. He had access to your home for months, maybe years." I felt sick. "We'll try to track the car," he continued. "But if he's been following you this long, he'll find you again." I swallowed. He was right. I wasn't safe. Not yet. And the only way to end this? I had to stop running. I had to turn the tables on him. I parked my car in a different part of town and paid in cash for a dingy roadside motel. No paper trail, no digital footprint. Then, I did something that felt insane. I left a message, a single note, slipped under the door of my old apartment, the one I swore I'd never go near again. Meet me where it started. I didn't know if he'd find it. But if he did, he'd know exactly what it meant. The apartment. The place where he had lived inside my walls, watching me for months, maybe longer. I was going back to end this myself. The return, I arrived at midnight. The landlord had already sealed up the crawl spaces, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going inside. I was waiting outside in the alleyway behind the building, the only exit from the tunnels. If he was coming, he'd have to come through here. I crouched behind a dumpster, gripping the only weapon I had, a rusted crowbar I found near the construction site down the street. Every sound made my skin crawl. The distant hum of the city, a cat knocking over a trash can, my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, I heard it. A faint scraping noise, the sound of something moving inside the walls. I held my breath. The rusted metal vent on the side of the building began to shift. Then, with a slow, deliberate creak, it slid open. Face to face. A hand emerged first, pale, filthy, long fingers covered in grime. Then, his face followed. For the first time, I saw him clearly. His skin was sickly white, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes were too wide, unblinking, like he didn't know how to close them properly. His lips were cracked, twisted into something not quite a smile. And he was thin, so horribly thin, like he had spent years in the dark, feeding off scraps and stolen food. He slithered out of the vent with a quiet, unnatural grace, crouching low to the ground like an animal. Then he turned his head toward me and smiled. I couldn't move. I had spent so long fearing him, running from him. But now he was right in front of me. And he wasn't running at all. The fight. Why? My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. His smile didn't falter. You left. The way he said it, like a child disappointed in a broken toy, sent a wave of pure terror through me. I gripped the crowbar tighter. Stay the hell away from me. His head tilted like he was studying me. Then he lunged. I swung the crowbar. It connected with his shoulder with a sickening crack, knocking him sideways. But he barely reacted, like he didn't feel pain. He moved fast. Too fast. Before I could raise the crowbar again, he was on me, claw-like fingers grabbing at my throat. I struggled, gasping for breath, as his face hovered inches from mine. I could smell him. Damp, rotten, like something that had been living in a grave for too long. His grip tightened. Spots danced in my vision. Then, with every ounce of strength I had left, I drove my knee into his stomach. He staggered back, and I swung again, this time aiming for his head. The impact sent him crashing to the ground. He didn't get up. I stood there, chest heaving, staring down at his motionless body. Was he dead? Had I finally stopped him? Then, his lips curled into a smile, and he laughed, soft at first, then louder, more hysterical. I ran. I didn't look back, because I knew he wasn't human, and I had only bought myself time. I ran. I didn't stop. The city blurred around me, streetlights casting eerie pools of yellow on the pavement as I sprinted toward the one place I knew he couldn't follow. The police station. By the time I reached the entrance, I was gasping for breath, my hands trembling so hard I could barely push the door open. An officer behind the desk looked up, startled. "Ma'am, are you—" I choked out. "He's still out there. I saw him. My knees nearly buckled, and someone rushed forward to grab me before I collapsed. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the dampness on my cheeks. It should have been over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The search. The police searched the alleyway behind my old apartment. They found the vent forced open, the rusted metal bent outward, but he was gone. No blood, no body, nothing. Like he had never been there at all. I overheard one officer murmur to another. He probably slipped into the tunnels again. Might have had another exit. Another exit. The thought made me want to vomit. How many ways in and out had there been? Had I ever been safe? The last warning. The police let me stay in protective custody for a few nights. I barely slept. Every noise made my skin crawl. Every shadow felt like it was hiding him. Then, on the fourth night, one of the officers, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, came to check on me. "We traced the black sedan," she said. "Found it abandoned a few miles outside the city." I gripped the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "And?" She hesitated. There was a note inside. A heavy silence filled the room. Finally, she pulled a small plastic evidence bag from her pocket. Inside was a single scrap of paper, torn at the edges. Shaky handwriting covered it in red ink. "You should have stayed." My stomach dropped. I felt cold all over, because I knew what that meant. He had never been chasing me. I had been running exactly where he wanted me to go. I left the city, but I moved, not to another state, not to another town. I went off the grid, cash only, no credit cards, no forwarding address. I found a place in the middle of nowhere, a tiny cabin deep in the woods, no neighbors, no one for miles. If he wanted to find me, he'd have to work for it. For a while, I felt safe. Then, 3 months later, I woke up to find a single footprint in the snow outside my cabin. Just one. And when I followed it, leading away from my porch, it stopped just at the edge of the trees, like whoever made it had been standing there, watching, waiting, smiling. The end, or not. I used to live alone. Now, I never feel alone at all. And some nights when the wind is just right and the forest is too quiet, I swear I hear something scraping inside my walls.